listening to Footscray Live.
Welcome everyone, you're listening to Footscray Live, coming to you live from Footscray City College. My name is Piper, and with me today I have Hannah, Gronya, Julian and Marley. This is the Relationship Show, and our guest today is youth relationship expert Sue Payne. Hey Sue, welcome to the show. So you're
Thank you for having me.
a youth expert. What does that require for you in our community?
I think probably the best youth experts are youth themselves, but I've been talking and discussing sex and relationships with young people for a number of years, so that's where I get my information from.
Where do you think, when did you decide you wanted to focus on that?
About 8 years ago, I was sort of shifting careers, and I decided that I wanted to do something with teenagers. I'd sort of moved out of that for a little while, but I missed them, believe it or not.
Yeah. Where did it start for you? Where did it all start?
Well, many years ago I worked in hospitality, and I taught lots of teenagers in TAFE colleges. So that's where the love of teenagers came from, as well as my own. And I moved into some jobs where I was working with some young people that were a bit isolated from mainstream school, and so got to know them a little bit better and what some of their needs were. And just over time, it seemed to be a good opportunity. When it came up, it was like, I think I'd like to do that. So I had some training with the company I first started with, and off I went.
You teach sex education. How tough is that with teenagers?
It's actually great. It's not tough at all. Yeah, I think you want to engage them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes if the word respectful relationship, you can see their eyes glaze over.
Yeah.
Because it's such a catch cry at the moment. It's so important, but it's sometimes has that impact. So it's about engaging them, but it's not hard at all.
Do you think there's a sort of stigma around sex, especially with teenagers going through puberty?
Yeah, I don't know whether there's a stigma, but I think there's just a huge curiosity, and it's a normal part of life to be curious about, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we encourage children to be curious about everything else.
Yeah.
And then yet some people shut down when it comes to wanting to know how we got here and what it's like to be in a sexual relationship. So
What do you think the best advice for teenagers that are starting to get into relationships and stuff like that is?
I guess, to take their time getting to know somebody, because someone can, really look really hot and attractive, but if they bore you stupid, then, why would you want to be with them, sort of thing. So you've got to come up with something more than just the physical attraction, and getting to know somebody perhaps before you take that physical attraction too far. Yeah, so it builds trust in each other. And if you trust someone, then you don't feel so vulnerable and you can be more intimate.
When do you think is a suitable age for parents to have the birds and the bees talk with their children?
Wow, there's so many different opinions out there. Some people start at the very beginning and they'll tell their 4-year-old how babies are made, and other families won't release that information ever, and usually the children learn from other people, or hopefully from school in a safe setting where they can ask lots of questions.
Gronya here. What would you say is the best way to connect with kids when you're talking about sex education and when you're educating them?
Well, I suppose not sort of talking down to them in the sense that if I go in to do a talk with a class or with a year level group, it's not always a lot of time, but asking them a little bit about what are their expectations of this next hour or this class. What are they hoping for? And then knowing that there are some boundaries around what you can say and can't say depending on the year level and the school, working within that, the things that they are keen to know.
Does it ever get awkward for you teaching it? I know that a lot of kids find it awkward, to learn about it and stuff. Does it feel awkward to teach?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. But if I'm going through a session and I can sense the awkwardness in the students, that then maybe puts just a little bit of pressure on me to, okay, how can I get these guys to relax? And but no, not awkward for me so much. Maybe in that first few months that I was out in school, it was a bit awkward.
Yeah.
Do you think media and society changes, I guess, a woman's representation in a relationship and a men's, but do you think it changes kids' perspectives on how relationships are?
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. I think, we're digesting all of this screen stuff for years from a very early age.
Yeah.
soapies, there's all sorts of relationship dramas and things that go on in Home and Away and Neighbours and, romantic movies, and then, of course, just what people might find out there on the internet, including pornography. All of it plays a part, I think, in influencing maybe how we feel about stepping into that space. Yeah.
Why do you think, like, as teenagers, since we are all teenagers, why do you think there's, in some generations or years, there's more of an urge to rush into it? Do you think that's a problem with some people and some other people, and what plays into that?
Yeah, I think. Oh, look, it's a tough one. It's a good question, but it's a tough one to answer because there could be a whole lot of variables that might lead someone to get intimate too quickly. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, what do you think plays a part in relationships that go too fast? Like, some people just go straight into intimate things. Do you think there's specifics that play a part in that?
I think there's probably a desire to be wanted, maybe. Maybe there's even a deeper desire to be accepted and seen as attractive. So that they might jump that way because, even perhaps before they feel they're really ready, because they want to affirm themselves. Yeah, but I think you need to have that before you step into a sexual relationship.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of people do it, and lots of generations. You mentioned generations and, people have been curious about sex since people began. And there's all sorts of individual reasons.
Surrounding that, do you think that there's a change in generations? Like, do you think in the last generation it was less of a big deal, whereas today it is? Like, do you think there's a difference between generations?
In having sex, in being...
Just in intimate relationships?
I think there is. From where I'm standing at my age, there's a difference in that we didn't have the same influences. There was always the curiosity, and if I wanted to know something, I could go to the encyclopedia or the dictionary. Wow, and that might give me a definition. And that was kind of exciting in my era. But now, push a couple of buttons and you've got a lot of really explicit graphic sex scenes in front of you. So I think pornography plays a part. Yeah.
What messages are you pushing when you teach sex education to teenagers?
To be true to yourself. And also to be talking with the adults in your life. Sometimes that's hard. Some parents feel really awkward talking to their children about sex and vice versa. But, to find out why they might have the opinions that they have, and perhaps for parents to share their values and why they hold them, that can be really empowering for their children to hear why they hold those values. And an open line of communication that, a child can go home and say, look, I heard about this in the playground. Dad, what does that mean? And for Dad to be willing to explain it. And, I think that's a thing that I encourage young people to do, to talk to the adults at home. And, to understand how pressure works, peer pressure and pressure perhaps in intimate relationships, that's really important too. To know that if you're feeling a lot of pressure, that's probably a sign that you probably don't want to do that just yet.
You talked about peer pressure, and if, let's say, a student doesn't have a adult that they trust in their life, or they don't have a teacher that they would feel comfortable talking to sex with, how do you recommend that they go and talk to? Who would they go talk to if they needed to talk to someone about sex?
Yeah, well, luckily there's a lot of organisations out there that are funded to help young people. Headspace springs to mind. But, even if you don't want to discuss specific details with a teacher is in a position to organise some professional help.
Right.
And I think I always remind students of that. Just, always remember during primary, secondary and even at uni, you can be put in touch with someone who can be really helpful, an expert that can help you work through what you're dealing with, whatever that may be, whether it might be about intimacy in general or about pressure in a relationship to do things that you don't want to do. So,
do you think it's a parent's job to be supportive of their kids? Because I know that for a lot of teenagers, not talking about specifics to us, but for a lot of teenagers it's really scary to have to tell your parents about any of that stuff. Do you think that it's a parent's kind of job to be supportive, or...?
Yeah, I think I do. I do. I'm thinking more now as a parent than in the role that I have professionally. It's been my experience that if you're open to hearing their point of view and being supportive, of their choices, then ultimately that leads to a closer relationship. And the more you do that, the more they come to you and talk to you. So, but it's sometimes hard. Sometimes you hear things from your children that, perhaps you wish they weren't up to, but that can be happen in any family. Yeah.
Going back to peer pressure, would you say that there's more peer pressure to be in either intimate relationships or even relationships in general now rather than a few years ago?
Actually, no, I don't. I don't think the pressure to be in a couple, in a relationship is any more. That's not what I'm hearing anyway. The pressure I tend to hear about through question boxes, anonymous question boxes where they don't have to highlight who they are, they don't have to name themselves, how to deal with pressure within the relationship and specifically about doing things, sexual things that they may not want to do or they don't feel ready for yet. Yeah.
Talking about if you're not ready to have intimate moments with your partner, how would you say that you don't want to have sex with them? Well,
it's funny when you ask a class, people will just say no.
Yeah.
But in the moment, it's a bit different because it may be that there's a lot of desire there in that moment, and but there's also a little voice, that little voice that we call it, or just a sense inside that I'm just I'm feeling pretty horny, but I don't know that I want to actually do that.
Yeah.
So, I think we have to just encourage people to find their voice and say, hey, can we talk about this? This is what you want to do. Can we talk about it? Because I feel this way about it.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't mind trying that. How do you feel about that? That sort of have a discussion about it. I think if you can't talk about it very openly, then you're probably not really ready to be having sex. Yeah, but it can be awkward. It seems sometimes that it's easier to take your clothes off and have sex than talk about sex.
Yeah.
Which is crazy, but true for a lot of people, I think. Yeah.
When you were taught sex ed, what do you think there's a right and a wrong way to teach it?
Well, what initially comes to mind is that, whoever's presenting to or running, facilitating a class or talking about sex needs to keep their own values out of it. So, each person, I think it's about delivering factual information and options when someone's struggling with something, but ultimately it comes down to what they believe is good for them, in sync with their values. And I think that's probably the key, that you keep your own opinions out of it. So I try to always preface, if I'm going to offer an opinion, I try to preface it, well, this is just my opinion, but typically I leave my thoughts out of it. Yeah.
Talking about relationships, how do you deal with your significant other or even yourself if you've cheated in a relationship?
Yeah. It's, if you looked at some parts of the world, we seem to get that message, through a whole lot of movies and media, and that it's okay, that there seems to be this sort of feeling like what people don't know won't hurt them. But of course, there's a lot of evidence and research to show that, when your partner cheats on you, it is really hurtful and sometimes damaging for future relationships in the sense of, in the sense of having trust in somebody. I think, again, you have to sit with your own values and decide, is this something I can deal with and keep that relationship if that's what the people both wanted, or is this time to walk away? And I suppose in young people's lives, it's probably time to walk away. But again, I'll preface that by saying this is my opinion, because I think there is a lot of exploring that goes on with young people and they're not ready to commit to anybody. So if they've stepped out to have a bit of fun with somebody else, it's probably a sign that the relationship needs to end. Yeah.
Just a reminder, you're listening to the Relationship Show on Footscray Live with Sue Payne. When you were growing up, do you think you were taught sex ed the right way, and do you think you had enough outlet for you as a teenager?
No and no. So I grew up in a very strict Catholic household. If there was any sign of any nudity, my mum would sprint to the TV to change the channels. But as a young person, I'd noticed that, but I'd also noticed Dad smirking behind the newspaper, so I was getting these really mixed signals. There was something really wrong about this, but also something kind of funny. And as I grew up, I learned a little bit more, but there were no formal programs at school.
Yeah.
And the only talk I got from my mother was about periods. Yeah.
Would you say that most schools, it's a necessity that all classes are taught sex education, or sometimes put it in the curriculum in health, or just do you think that it's necessary that all schools have a sex education in some form?
Oh, absolutely. And it is part of the curriculum and the respectful relationships curriculum, and it even ties in with the child safety standards too, that if we don't do that through schools, then the only children that will learn it, appropriately, I suppose would be the word, will be those that have parents that are willing to sit down with them. And that's not the majority at all. So we need to have programs that start at a certain point and just layered each year with some more information and lots of chances for the children to ask questions in that safe space in the classroom, perhaps anonymously through the question boxes and things. But if we don't offer it, then the only other education they'll get is from friends, which may or may not be correct, and might be interlaced with their values, not your own, or from movies and pornography and that kind of thing, or the social media influences. That's not a good way to get a sex education, I don't think.
Do you think it's fair surrounding like parents who don't like the idea of it? Do you think it's fair for them to be angry or upset with their kids for going to talk about that sort of stuff with them?
So that the parents might be...
Do you think
just tell me that one again?
Do you think it's fair for parents to be upset with their kids about talking to them about that stuff?
No, I think they should be delighted. And that's what I try and tell parents. If your child's sort of trying to ask you something, and alluding to something about, sex or relationships, you've got to be open to it, because if you're not, then you miss that chance to share your values with your child and get some of their wisdom that they've picked up along the way. Yeah.
Speaking as a parent, what age do you think should be a suitable age to start a relationship or even start an intimate relationship?
Yeah, I had a feeling someone was going to ask me that today. Look, I'll say what I truly believe, but also what I say in the classes, and that's that there's no right or wrong age, really. Of course, the law tells us there's an age of consent, which of course is worth considering, I think. And there are conditions around that. I'm sure you've all learnt a little bit about that. Just because someone reaches the age of 16 doesn't mean that they're ready to have sex.
Yeah.
Often it's when you've reached a point in yourself where you're physically grown up, you're more emotionally grown up, so you're more mature. Maybe you've had a couple of relationships where there hasn't been any sexual intimacy, but you've learned something from those relationships. Everyone that we have, whether they end badly or not, we learn something about ourselves and about relationships. So when you hit that point where you're with someone and you feel that you can trust them and they trust you and you have a connection, that's when you're going to have the better sex anyway. So that might be the time when you step into that kind of a relationship.
Yep.
It's got to be the right context, and really the context for the best possible sex is where you can be really vulnerable and yet still feel safe.
Yep.
So if you've got that with somebody, then that's worth that's worth a lot in terms of your choices of when you might become sexually active. Yeah.
Respect, surrounding the respect for women in society, do you cover that? Do you talk about that in your teaching?
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, we do. I find that conversations like that often end up being conversations about pornography. So, there's a lot of things tying into the lack of respect for women in certain societies and certain contexts. And I think, it's true that a lot of young guys, and some females too, watch the sorts of things that they see on porn sites. And even though if you ask them, that's not really how it all works, well, oh, yeah, I know it's kind of fake. But if they watch enough of it, and they see that the way women's bodies are handled, all the really aggressive titles to all these little clips, you sort of wonder how this violence sort of got caught up. We're sort of creating it as a sexy thing to be rough, and women aren't represented there very well at all. They're not treated well. And look, I don't think men are represented very well either. Often they look kind of animalistic and even soulless, the way. And that's not how men and women can be. You know, so there's not a lot of respect in those encounters, and that does have some influence, I think, on people that watch porn or watch a lot of it anyway. Yeah.
What, like when you are teaching, do you find that there's a specific way of teaching that really gets to kids, like connects to them better than others? Because I know that sometimes if you say you wouldn't teach a class right, and I'm not saying that you would, but
Yeah.
do you think there is a way to teach a class better than not?
I think that, yes, there is, and I think you have to sort of look at the curriculum, but you also need to look at what young people want to know. And a lot of that is, you know, how does it feel? You know, does it hurt? You know, it's about pleasure. It's about wanting to know, you know, how that all works. And I think if you can give a little bit, then you'll open up to other things to talk about. So a lot of students by Year 9, they've heard all about contraception and STIs and they've talked about all the health issues, the physical health issues, but they haven't talked much about the emotional parts of relationships and the intimacy between people and what happens when trust is broken in various ways, and how do you break up with someone and not hurt their feelings?
Yeah.
Or how do you get someone to notice you when you really like them? And yeah, so I think it's more than just about sex. I think if you can open your conversation up in classrooms about that, but also be willing to say things like, well, you know, let's talk a little bit about anatomy. You might know how your own works, but do you know how the others work? The person, if you're same-sex attracted, you've got a great advantage.
Yeah.
But if you're not, then, you know, you're in a sense, I guess, you know, you've got to find out a little bit about that. And there's things you can find out. But then encouraging young people to say, but it's not just about what you read in a book. You've got to ask your partner, you've got to communicate with your partner. Does this feel good? Do you want to do that? That kind of thing. And that's something that I think helps young people engage.
Yeah.
How do I do it? Type of thing. Yeah.
As a teacher, do you think that it would have influenced your career choice if you had been taught like sex ed and health like the proper way or like a better way in school?
That's an interesting question. Well, I don't know, probably, although I did feel when I first got involved that it was probably something that I was drawn to because I'd had such a bad experience growing up. Like nothing, there was no knowledge, nothing was shared at all other than, you know, the nuns saying, we don't talk about that. So it was, that drew me a little bit to making a contribution to future generations and sharing knowledge and helping them and encouraging them to, you know, to live authentically according to their own values, whether that was, sometimes people don't want to even contemplate sexual intimacy until they're married, because that's their values and that's fine. Others feel differently. So, but so long as you feel true to yourself, yeah.
Alright, I know everyone has their own values, but for you, what do you think are your top 3 values for keeping a relationship sustainable?
Oh, well, absolutely, you know, trust is so important and honesty, but maybe not so much a value, but you've got to be able to communicate without judgment, to be able to hear someone say to you something that they perhaps don't like about your behaviour or how you upset them, and take it on board without getting defensive.
Yeah.
Or changing the subject or firing back at what you don't like about them, sort of thing. So that's probably the top one, you know. Sharing the joys, that's easy and it's wonderful and we should. But when one person's feeling disappointed in the other, being able to communicate about that without it leading to, you know, anger and, you know, sort of upset. So, yeah.
How do you think teenagers should go? I know that it's a big issue among girls, like surrounding 15 to 18 sort of ages, telling their mum or dad that they want to go on birth control. How do you think that's, like, how do you think it should be done between parents and kids?
Yeah. Well, ideally, I think if a child was contemplating sex with a boyfriend or girlfriend, then they might have already discussed that a little bit with an adult, but maybe not. So then it could be a bit of a surprise or a shock for the parent to have this question. But that ideally, I think it should be done with the parents. Unfortunately, it's often not. Yeah.
Do you talk about sexuality in your curriculum with young people, the teenagers?
When you say sexuality, what specifically do you mean?
Coming out to your parents or starting your first relationship with, like you just came out as LGBTQ.
Okay,
and
yep.
You are starting your first relationship.
Yeah. Oh, of course. That's a part of our human sexuality. So we need to discuss all types of identity and orientation. It's an emerging thing over time as a young person grows up. They start to become aware of who turns them on and who and how they feel inside. So if they've got this struggle with their body and they feel differently to all of those things that can make it harder for young people. We have to talk about those things. So they're a big part. And you can start off sort of early and just explain the terminology and what it means so that when young people start high school, they understand a little bit. And then hopefully you layer that, as you go on, you help people understand that we're all emerging into adulthood with the same we're all on the same path in the sense that we're going to find out who we are as we go along and who we're attracted to, and it's about accepting that. Yeah.
Look, we've got to wrap up the show, but thank you so much for joining us, Sue. And thank you to my panel, Hannah, Julian, Gronya. This is Piper, and that was a relationship show on Footscray Live.
Thanks for having me.
You're listening to Footscray Live.